This movie is based on a true story. The events take place in the 19th century. Charles Darwin is telling his daughter about a wild tribe that first encountered Europeans. Young Annie Darwin is very nervous before her first photograph. She is curious about how light creates an image. The father explains it to her from a scientific perspective. While the photographer set up the camera, Charles continued to tell his daughter about Europeans and the natives. Captain Fitzroy offered them cloth and buttons as a sign of peace. In return, he only wanted a few people from the tribe. For the natives, the youngest members of the tribe had no value, while the buttons were considered treasures. So the Aborigines received trinkets, and the captain took 3 individuals. The kind captain taught the tribe's children good manners to make them resemble civilized people. Unfortunately, one of them passed away from smallpox, and the other 2 learned prayers and multiplication tables so well that they were invited to the king's court. Everyone agreed that Christian virtue could conquer even the wildest hearts. The children received gifts from the king and queen, which was considered a great honor. 2 years later, the captain took the children back to their homeland, hoping that their example would help their tribesmen find faith in God. However, upon seeing the native land, they quickly forgot all their good manners and returned to their wild habits. It was a complete failure. Charles Darwin, by the way, was one of the participants in that expedition. Annie couldn't help but smile. At that time, Charles had no idea that the daughter's photograph would be last. As a naturalist, Charles Darwin spends a lot of time on his biological research. He often forgets about dinner, so the maid reminds him. Charles and his wife Emma now have 4 children. Charles looks sickly and has no appetite. Before dinner, Emma, being a very devout woman, as usual says a prayer. Without touching the soup, Charles apologizes and leaves the table. On October 17, 1858, Charles was studying the selective breeding of pigeons. He believed that all ornamental breeds originated from the blue rock pigeon. Nature selects species for survival, while humans select for beauty. Soon Joseph Hooker, an old acquaintance of Charles, arrived. Emma greeted the guest, who was accompanied by Thomas Huxley. He insisted on his personal presence because he wanted to ask some questions to Emma's reclusive husband. Charles was clearly not ready for a serious conversation. Later, Emma observed as her husband, Joseph, and Thomas left to speak privately. Thomas expressed admiration for Charles's research, in which he seeks to prove that all species on Earth didn't result from divine intervention but rather through evolution. Charles is currently writing a book about it, but he's not sure if it's worth publishing. Thomas tried to dispel his doubts, believing that Charles Darwin will be the one to push God into the background. Suddenly Charles felt unwell again. Thomas continued his fervent speech, stating that they must win the war between religion and science. Only then can the truth prevail. Charles disagrees with this. Be that as it may, the Church unites society, and without God many people will lose the meaning of life. But Thomas Huxley has no intention of backing down. In his opinion, there will soon be no place for God in civilized society. Before the guests left, Emma asked Joseph not to pressure her husband. Later, Joseph conveyed Emma's words to Thomas. It's evident that Charles is full of doubts, so it's their duty to dispel those doubts. Charles suffers from bouts of nausea and vomiting. These episodes are becoming more frequent. Despite this, Charles continues his research. He often thinks about his daughter Annie, whom he misses very much. Charles tracks the evolution of mollusks and all their species over 30 million years. If Annie were here, she would find it interesting too. Charles delays the publication of his research because of the religious wife and a small chest in the room. He often reminisces about how Annie was just a little girl. Charles truly enjoyed doting on the daughter while his wife played the piano. The spouses were very happy in their marriage and dreamed of having a large family. Soon their dream came true. Charles loved spending time with his children, wife, and friends. Annie grew up as a very curious girl and asked a million questions. The father joyfully explained everything she asked. Before becoming a husband and a father, Charles traveled extensively and conducted research. Currently, he has a dispute with Reverend Innes, who believes that nature exists in harmony in the world. Charles and Joseph, on the other hand, believe that all of nature is a constant battlefield. All species fight for survival and dominance on Earth. Indeed, nature is an ongoing cycle of life and death. Some perish to support the lives of others, and it continues endlessly. Charles constantly contemplates this cycle, seeking answers to questions that have haunted him for many years. Emma, on the other hand, often reads the Bible to the children, trying to instill in them a love for God. This evening, Charles finally decided to open that very chest containing memories of Annie. He would give anything to have his daughter back. Charles is also uncertain whether he is doing the right thing by taking religion away from humanity. What will people do when they realize there is no hope or faith, only a struggle for survival? Furthermore, it would break Emma's heart. Annie used to ask the father to tell her the story of Jenny. It was about a family of orangutans living in the jungles of Borneo. Their eldest daughter was the most loving, caring and trusting of all the monkeys. But she was also the smartest and most curious. One day this played a cruel trick on her. Local Aboriginal hunters set a trap to catch prey. Seeing fruits in a basket, Jenny climbed down from the tree. When she realized the danger, it was too late. The hunters captured the curious monkey and sold her to a trader, who in turn sold her to the London Zoo. She was the first orangutan that the English had ever seen. That's when Charles met her. Charles was one of the first people to truly gain Jenny's trust. They formed a special bond. When the time came to say goodbye, Jenny fell into melancholy. Before going to sleep, Charles told the wife that Huxley was waiting for his book. Now for Charles, it's a matter of moral courage. It will take a few more months to finish the book. Emma is afraid that her husband doesn't care about his soul. If he doesn't renounce his radical beliefs, he won't enter the gates of heaven, and that means the spouses will be separated forever. On the one hand, Charles is afraid to continue his research because he's unsure if he's ready to discover the answers. On the other hand, he is a scientist and must believe only in facts. Emma hasn't changed her opinion. She believes that Charles is waging a war against God, and he won't emerge victorious from this battle. Charles couldn't fall asleep, remembering the day the family spent at the beach. Back then, none of them knew that a great sorrow would soon befall them. The weather was windy, but despite that, Annie didn't want to dress warmly. Charles didn't think much of it. One day Annie came home in tears and told the father that Reverend Innes had punished her for talking about dinosaurs. Of course Charles couldn't ignore this. However, Emma saw nothing wrong in the Reverend's actions. He simply wanted their daughter to repent. Charles couldn't believe his wife was serious. But Emma begged her husband not to make a big deal out of it. Everyone believes in the Bible, it's a tradition passed down through generations. In the end Charles gave in. On Sunday, the Darwin family as usual attended church service. However Charles, listening to the prayers, could no longer bear it and left. Later, he left a note for his wife, in which he outlined that he declared war not on God but on himself. Charles spends a lot of time alone, listening to nature. He is one of the few who knows for sure that it's not the work of God's hands but billions of years of evolution. Charles often takes the children to nature, and they observe animals together. This time a hungry fox was hunting a rabbit. It was a vivid example of how everything in nature revolves around survival. Charles's youngest daughter, Eddie, cried and said it wasn't fair. Annie explained to her sister that foxes must hunt rabbits, or else the fox cubs would perish. It's a balance in nature. Hearing this, Charles felt proud of his daughter. Finally, Charles wrote a letter to Joseph, stating that he is willing to defend his beliefs for the sake of his children. Charles plans to title his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. He will try not to mention the Lord in it. Charles will dedicate the first chapter to domestication of animals, to show how great the power of humans is in breeding new animal breeds. Then Charles will talk about natural selection leading to the extinction of less adapted species. Because of his illness, Charles's hands trembled, slowing down the work on the book. Before going to sleep, Charles asked his wife if she was still angry with him. Emma said she wasn't angry, she pitied him. Charles resorted to hydrotherapy, hoping it would alleviate his condition. No difficulties could make Charles give up writing the book. He narrated about the evolution of species, which he found more astonishing than anything written in the Bible. At night sitting by the fireplace, Charles again thought about his daughter. He missed their conversations. Charles felt himself slowly going mad. He also felt guilt for not being able to save the daughter. Emma realized that something was happening to the husband, but he spoke so rarely to her that there was no understanding between them. The wife insisted that Charles speak with Reverend Innes. However, Charles shunned the church, engrossed in his research. He remembered talking to a man who bred pigeons. The man said that inbreeding was the fastest way to change a species. The risk was that this method also weakened the species. In the past, Annie fell ill. The doctor said the girl likely caught a cold after the beach outing. The doctor prescribed mercury chloride for Annie, but Charles adamantly refused to give his daughter this medication. In his opinion, it was highly toxic. When the doctor left, Charles insisted on taking his daughter to Malvern, but Emma reassured her husband. The woman believed their daughter would recover soon. She just needed rest. Charles agreed to wait another week. In the present, Charles couldn't write again due to hand tremors. In a semi-sleep state, it seemed to Charles that the specimens in his study room were coming to life. However, it was just a nightmarish dream. Charles was going mad, feeling helpless before himself. In the morning, he received mail. Charles read the letter and couldn't contain his hysterical laughter. During the day, Reverend Innes visited Charles, inquiring about his book. Charles said he was no longer writing the book because a man named Russell Alfred Wallace had come to the same conclusions and condensed it into just 20 pages. Charles had written 250 pages and was now at a standstill. He felt that 20 years of his life had been wasted. The priest gave Charles a reassuring hug, saying that the ways of the Lord are inscrutable. Charles was angry at this statement, and he told Innes what he thought. The priest realized he wasn't welcome here and left. It looked like their friendship was over. Emma watched in horror as her husband conversed with Annie, who was long gone. Charles continued to beg his daughter to come back. In desperation, Charles released all the experimental pigeons from their cages. He was ready to tear down the shed with his bare hands, just to rid himself of this burden. At some point, Charles lost consciousness. Their home was visited by a doctor who prescribed warmth and absolute rest for Charles. At the first opportunity, Joseph Hooker visited Charles, who, like Thomas Huxley, believed that Charles had given up too soon. Wallace had written only 20 pages, whereas Charles had thoroughly researched the subject. Charles was too weak, but Joseph didn't consider it a valid reason for inaction and made his friend get out of bed. Together they must win. In the end, Charles went to Malvern, remembering how he had intended to take his daughter there in the past. Emma couldn't go with them because she was pregnant. A week passed, but Annie's condition didn't improve. Hydrotherapy became their last hope. When the husband and daughter left, Emma cried out of helplessness. Deep down, she understood that she would never see her eldest daughter again. In the present, Charles, looking very pale, visited a doctor in Malvern. The doctor advised him to refrain from intellectual work and prescribed hydrotherapy. Long days in the hospital began. Some time ago, Annie had gone through the same thing, but her condition only worsened. In desperation, Charles went to church and, kneeling down, prayed to God to save his daughter. He pledged to believe until the end of his days if God would have mercy. In the present, Charles confessed to the doctor that memories of the daughter contributed to the exacerbation of his strange symptoms. His wife believed that Annie was in heaven, and this comforted her. However, Charles didn't believe in fairy tales about paradise. Charles remembered the past once again. No miracle could save his daughter. Emma prayed constantly. Since then, she sought refuge in religion, and Charles in science. Of course, it had an impact on their marriage. There was nothing left for them to talk about. This wasn't the only tragedy that befell the family. Their youngest son, baby Charlie, only lived for a few weeks. Charles couldn't speak of it without tears. The doctor advised Charles to visit Annie's grave to ease his soul, but Charles could not find the resolve to do so. Not wanting to discuss it, he intended to leave the town as his condition improved. However, the doctor blocked Charles's path, saying that until he had faith in something, no waters of the world could heal him. Charles left the hospital after all, contemplating what to do next. At some point he saw Annie again, running away from him. This led him to the hotel. Charles entered. The owners immediately recognized the scientist, who had stayed here some time ago. Charles asked for the keys to the very same room. The landlady did not refuse. Climbing the stairs, Charles recalled how he had brought medicines for his daughter. Despite all the efforts of the doctors, Annie was still not improving. At night, Charles wrote a letter to his wife, saying that Annie was getting better. The efforts of the doctors had finally started to yield results. However, the next day, Annie's condition worsened again. Her fever intensified. Hope would appear and disappear, and it was tormenting the soul. In his final letter, Charles wrote to his wife that they should prepare for the worst. One day, with a weak voice, Annie asked the father to tell her how the story of Jenny ended. It was hard for Charles to talk about it now, as this story had an unhappy ending, but for his daughter's sake he got over himself. From the zookeeper, Charles learned that Jenny had contracted pneumonia. The zookeeper had tried to feed her with a spoon, but she just shook her head. The zookeeper was deeply touched by the peacefulness of this animal that looked so much like a human being. These were the final moments of Jenny's life. After hearing the story, Annie passed away. Charles couldn't accept the loss of his daughter and wept. In the present, he also wept. Everyone in the hotel could hear his sobs, full of grief and pain. Upon returning home, Charles confessed to his wife that he often saw Annie. But for Emma it was not a surprise. She had long noticed that her husband talked to their deceased daughter. Another conflict arose between the spouses. Emma wants to believe that their daughter is in heaven, but Charles shattered that hope with his scientific theory. Charles in turn wants to hear that the wife doesn't blame him for Annie's demise. After all, it was he who allowed their daughter to go to the beach lightly dressed. With tears in her eyes, Emma told the husband that she never blamed him but blamed herself for not going with them to Malvern. For the first time in a long while, the spouses were truly honest with each other. Charles expressed the thought that perhaps they shouldn't have married, given that they were cousins. Now their sons and daughters had poor health. Charles initially knew it was wrong, but he loved Emma too much. She said that even if they had the opportunity to turn back time, she would still marry him. The spouses held hands, forgiving each other for everything. Winter came. Charles opened the cherished trunk again. It was filled with determination to continue working on his book. Months of diligent work followed. Charles had to finish the second half of the book, outlining the theory of evolutionary development. Now, Emma reads fairy tales to the children instead of the Bible. One evening Charles decided to replace her. The grief from losing the eldest daughter had made him distant, but now Charles intended to make up for lost time and spend more time with his children. When Charles finished the book, he asked his wife to be its first reader. Someone had to look at it from a perspective closer to God's. If his wife deemed it necessary to burn the book, Charles would do so. Emma began reading on the origin of species by means of natural selection. She didn't stop for sleep, even at night. In the morning, Charles saw his wife starting a fire in the garden. However, she was only disposing of fallen leaves. Emma handed Charles his packaged book, ready to be sent to the publisher. She hadn't lost her faith, but was ready to support the beloved husband in his radical views. Charles sent the book to the publisher with the postman. This book would change the world forever, overturning humanity's previous notions of origins. In the final scene, we see Charles Darwin returning home with Annie. Then, a voiceover tells us about the real characters of this story. The entire print run of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection was sold out on the day of its publication. Emma and Charles lived happily in marriage until his passing at the age of 73. Charles was buried according to Christian customs.